Welcome to the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show. This is our 95th episode. My name is Andy Z. I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, California, and today is March 31st, 2022. March 31st, the last day of the month. I grew up and lived most of my life in the Northeast, where there is the saying, endlessly repeated in anticipation of spring, that March comes in like a lion and goes out like a lamb. A reassurance people say to get through the stormy and frigid days that begin the month, and then the beginning of the thaw and the flowering of spring that now welcomes April. So in thinking about today's RNL show on this last day of March, I had thoughts of lions and lambs which intruded into my early morning. These thoughts were also more profoundly provoked by something I learned of. A young Latina said, after she went out with the RevComs to the Los Angeles Marathon to speak to, arouse, and organize the people gathered to watch the marathon on Santa Monica Boulevard, about the need to take to the streets to stop the U.S. Supreme Court from taking away the right of women to have safe and legal abortions. This was the first time that this young woman ever went out to a crowd of strangers to talk and struggle for people to stand up for this fundamental right. She told of being nervous at first, but then she found her voice and soon ceased to be intimidated by the questions or even by the people who didn't agree. Afterwards, she wanted to share her experience with others, and for that reason, I'm sharing it with you. She said that there are lots of other young women like her who have to, quote, let the lion in them out, end quote. Let the lion in them out. I was reminded of a fierce talk by a high school freshman or sophomore at the New York City International Women's Day rally on March 8th for abortion rights, who spoke to the hundreds of people gathered there with great passion, saying that it is right for people to feel their rage and to act on it. This is why we RevComs say, unleash the fury of women as a mighty force for revolution. Now note the first word of this slogan, unleash. This means that those who have come to recognize the problem that humanity faces, those who urgently feel the tremendous need to solve all the problems we face, as well as those who have come to understand that the solution to everything that plagues the people here and around the world requires a real revolution. All of us, and we are potentially many, need to free ourselves and go out fired up to free the people from the mental shackles that this system imposes on how people think. Today, what is needed are lions and not sheep. No more of the masses of people being lambs to the slaughter. There is a way to know and change the world, and you are in the right place watching the right show. The RNL show is where we bring to you that there is a way out of all that oppresses people here and around the world. That there is a possibility of a radically indifferent and far better world. Right now, people in this country are thinking and acting like sheep. Why? Because they are thinking in the ways that this system compels people to think and tells them to think. On the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show, you will experience and learn from the revolutionary leader, Bob Avakian, who on the basis of 40 years of revolutionary work has qualitatively advanced the scientific approach to making revolution and emancipating all of humanity. In his book, Basics from the Talks and Writings from Bob Avakian, which is the handbook of revolution, the first quotation in chapter 4 on understanding the world says, quote, oppressed people who are unable or unwilling to confront reality as it actually is are condemned to remain enslaved and oppressed, end quote. A scientific approach to reality is the key to knowing and changing the world. In her book, Science and Revolution, the author, Ardea Skybrake, writes that science allows you to confront and identify problems rather than run away from them. More, she makes the essential point that, quote, without science, you are at the mercy of being manipulated, of having your thinking manipulated, and not being able to tell what's right from what's wrong, what's true from what's false, end quote. You need science. You need evidence. Without that, you will be played. Right now, people are being played big time, repeating what's parroted by the media of what some government official or some powerful institution says, or what some religious figure says, or just repeating whatever's trending on the internet or popular in school, or repeating what your parents and family tell you to think when they too just heard it from the same or even anti-scientific sources. This is one important part of why people are acting like sheep and not the lions that they could be. In today's show, we're going to take some time and answer a few of the questions that some of you have raised to us, the RevComs, in discussions and out in the streets and at the schools. Over the past several weeks on the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show, we've brought out in shocking ways the situation that we face. Last week in episode 94, I dramatically and substantively brought out the unbelievable horror and danger of nuclear war that has become more possible as the war in Ukraine grinds on. We have sounded the alarm of the danger to women, half of humanity in this country, who are poised to lose the right to abortion when the Supreme Court issues its decision in June, if we don't take to the streets this spring in massive numbers, week after week, and even day after day. We have brought out that losing this fundamental constitutional right will be a form of female enslavement. We have also brought out on the RNL show scientifically the danger of the climate crisis that could endanger the very future of human life on this planet. We have brought out the danger of a fascist future in this country with the Republican Fascist Party fighting to come to full power, a party that has discarded all the norms of how this country has been governed over the past 150 years to fully bludgeon into place a society of full-out white supremacy, patriarchy, and xenophobia enforced with state and vigilante terror and violence. All the while the Democrats conciliate and accommodate because they are the defenders and rulers of the very same system that has spawned this fascism. There is a terrible future that looms. People sense it. Some see it. But that is not all there is. This is where a scientific approach that undergirds a daring to wrench a positive future out of this horror is essential. Bob Avakian has written a major work which provides the foundation to understand this and the roadmap to get there. This work is titled Something Terrible or Something Truly Emancipating. Profound crisis, deepening divisions, the looming possibility of civil war, and the revolution that is urgently needed. A necessary foundation and a basic roadmap for this revolution. Listen here to what Bob Avakian says.
It is true that there are a lot of very bad things connected with the present polarization and the whole trajectory things are on, and this could lead to something really terrible. But it is also true, and of profound importance, that it is possible that we could wrench something really positive out of it. Revolution, to put an end to this system and bring something much better into being. But once more, this requires recognizing the situation and the current trajectory of things for what they are, and responding in a way and on a level that is commensurate with this, is in accordance with the profound stakes involved, acting to change things urgently toward the goal of getting rid of this whole system and replacing it with something radically different and much better.
There is a scientific way of understanding, of knowing, and then going to work to change the world. So with this, we're going to begin today's show, first of all, with my co-host, Sunsara Taylor, who's in New York City. She is also one of the initiators and leaders of Rise Up for Abortion Rights. She's going to do a very compelling segment on abortion, an important interview, and she's also going to take some questions that people have raised. Then we're going to go to Noche Diaz, who is the national spokesperson for the Revolution Clubs, and he too is going to take questions that have come up by people who've watched this show and by people we've met out in the streets on the war in Ukraine. After that, we're going to play an illustrated segment of a recent piece titled Avakian Calls Out Fronting for This System of Oppression, which will be followed by a segment on the confirmation hearings of Ketanji Brown Jackson, who is nominated by President Biden to be on the Supreme Court. But before we go to those segments, I'd like to close this opening with these words, which are a call and an invitation to get into this revolution from Avakian.
Everyone who can't stand this world the way it is, who is sick and tired of so many people being treated as less than human, who knows that the claim of liberty and justice for all is a cruel lie, who is righteously enraged that injustice and inequality go on and on and on, despite false promises and honeyed words from people in power or those seeking power. Everyone who agonizes about where things are headed and the fact that to be young now means being denied a decent future or any future at all. Everyone who has ever dreamed about something much better or even wondered whether that is possible. Everyone who hungers for a world without oppression, exploitation, poverty, and destruction of the environment. Everyone who has the heart to fight for something that is really worth fighting for. You need to be part of this revolution.
Imagine right now you are pregnant. Now, I don't care if you're male, female, non-binary, the wrong age to be pregnant. Just imagine right now you are pregnant and you are being forced by the state to have a child that you did not want. Think about the disruption that would cause to your life. Imagine you had a miscarriage and instead of getting the support and medical attention you need, you are arrested. You are put on trial and you are thrown in jail for endangering your fetus. Or imagine you were raped and impregnated by that rape, and the state came in and gave the power to your rapist and to his family to sue anybody who dared to help you get an abortion so you weren't forced to have the child of your rapist. And so nobody helped you, and you were forced. Everything I'm describing is already happening in this country or has already been signed into law and is set to become and go into effect in a matter of weeks. And this is just the beginning. We are living in an abortion rights emergency, and there is a ticking time bomb of female enslavement set to be detonated by the U.S. Supreme Court in June. They're set to rule on a case that could upend, that could gut, that could overturn completely nationwide protections to abortion. Women's fundamental right to decide for themselves when and whether to have a child, to have that measure of control over their bodies and their lives. This is the 5-alarm emergency that the movement RiseUpForAbortionRights.org that I initiated together with others set out to address. And we've accomplished some very important things. We put out a powerful statement that tells the truth about this emergency and about what needs to be done that's been signed by over 1,000 people, including many very prominent people. We've mobilized people in protest and resistance in the streets, including powerful protests on International Women's Day, March 8th, in over a dozen cities. All this gives a taste of the potential to bring people to stand up and stop this assault, but it is just a beginning, and it is far short of what is needed and what is necessary. We need millions in the streets standing up and refusing to let the Supreme Court get away with taking this right away. We need people acting in the streets, in the arts and the sciences, on the campuses with defiance and courage, not letting this go down. And so it's very important that everybody watching do everything they can in the next few days to build for powerful days that have been called by Rise Up for Abortion Rights on April 8th for people to wear this green bandana everywhere, on the campuses, in the workplaces, on the streets, everywhere. This is the symbol of in the streets struggle for abortion rights that started in Latin America and has spread around the world. And then April 9th to come into the streets in powerful protests nationwide for abortion on demand and without apology. So this is the theme of today's segment on the abortion rights emergency here on the RNL, the Revolution Nothing Less show. And the way we're going to get into this is with two major components. First, I've been inviting people who are part of this movement, Rise Up for Abortion Rights, especially young people who are newly involved, to send in their toughest questions. What are they running up against as they try to take this out and struggle for others to get involved in it? Both what are they running up against about how we get people to act, but also the questions of why this is happening. Where is this assault coming from, and what's it really going to take? So first, I'm going to speak to a couple of the questions that came in. There are more questions that came in that I'm going to address this time. We'll try to get to more of them in the future. I want to thank everybody who sent questions. And then after that, I'm going to share with you excerpts of an interview that I did with the author, educator, and novelist, Sikivu Hutchinson, who is also part of the Rise Up for Abortion Rights movement. And she addresses in particular the disproportionate impact of these abortion bans and denial of reproductive freedom on Black women in this country. So with that, let's go to our first question from a viewer. Let's watch.
Okay, so my first question is, sometimes when I'm giving out flyers, people just don't care because they feel that this whole crisis doesn't affect them, and that because of that, it's not their responsibility to deal with it. What can I say to those folks?
So the first thing I want to say is don't get discouraged. If everybody was already thinking and acting right, you wouldn't need to be out there. The fact that so many are zombie sleepwalking, it makes it all the more important that you're out there struggling with them and challenging them. So definitely don't get discouraged. That said, you're right, we can't just let ourselves be ignored or nothing's going to change. So what do you say to those who claim that this is not going to affect them and it's not their responsibility, this assault on women's fundamental right to abortion? You tell them they're wrong. Forcing women to have children against their will, denying the right to abortion, is female enslavement. That's half of humanity enslaved. And when half of humanity is enslaved, no one is free. This does affect you. And it is puny and small-minded to think only about yourself. Me, me, me. That's a mentality that gives the fascists a free hand to just march ahead, crushing the rights and the lives of women in state after state, gaining momentum until it's too late to stop them. So we have to challenge people. Stop being just about yourself the way this system wants you to think. Think about humanity. Stand for something that really matters. Live a life with meaning. Stand up and fight together with others for a future where women are free and all of humanity is free. That is a meaningful thing, a joyful thing, a beautiful thing to be about. And yes, sometimes it's hard, but it's worth it. And finally, I want to address the relationship between education and resistance. And it's very important. People don't know anything in this society. Most people don't know anything about the laws being passed, the threat that the Supreme Court currently poses to women's right to abortion. They don't know the harm, the horror this is bringing and will bring. So we have to get the flyers out everywhere. We have to get the fact sheets, the posters. We have to get this all over social media and everywhere else. We have to spread the information. But just as important, probably even more important, we need to make this question unignorable through our bold actions and creative actions that make people turn their heads and say, what do they know? What do they understand that makes them feel so strongly they're willing to get out there like that I need to find out about? We need to make them seek us out. I think, for example, of an experience in my own life in the lead up to the 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq, which was an illegal, unjust, immoral war. And I was out with others, spreading the word, spreading flyers, trying to get people to stand up against that war, talking to people everywhere, including at my job. And a lot of people ignored me, me and everybody else. They wanted to go on with their lives, just like what you're describing. And I remember walking into the break room one day at lunch, and everybody was transfixed watching the television. And we were watching as the police on the news were carrying anti-war protesters, lifting them and carrying them and arresting them one by one out of the street. And this act was so disruptive that everybody started debating and discussing. Some were inspired, some were outraged, but everybody was talking about it. And all of a sudden they were listening to the arguments from me and others that they had been ignoring. And this kind of thing was going on throughout society. This is what we need to do now. And there are many different kinds of creative ways. Civil disobedience is one of them, can be one of them. It's not the only way. That's why we take up this green bandana. It's a living model of massive, creative, bold, disruptive resistance that women in Argentina did that went up against a crushing weight of criminalizing and locking up women for abortions, miscarriages, making it illegal there. And women went in the streets. They wore the green bandana. They challenged everybody on their campuses to pick a side, show where you stand. You wear the green bandana if you stand against the criminalizing of abortion. You stand for women's rights. And if you don't wear a bandana, you're not neutral. You are choosing female enslavement. They got out there and they challenged others and it spread and they decriminalized abortion there. And then they did the same thing in Colombia and Mexico, and they're still fighting for it in other countries in Latin America. That's why we take this up here. So there's a lot of creative ways to do this. And people should be getting together, you watching, together with your friends, with others. How are we going to make this unignorable? And specifically on April 8th, the national day to wear green, called by Rise Up for Abortion Rights, how are we going to paint the town green with chalk, banner, bandanas everywhere? Everybody has to show where they stand. And on April 9th, back in the streets in powerful protest nationwide. And then how are we going to take this forward to really mobilize tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions to not let the Supreme Court get away with crushing this women's lives and taking this right away? So that's some of the dynamics I think we need to work on. But most of all, I want to reiterate, people should be talking with each other and sending in your ideas. And with that, I want to go to the second question that I want to address.
And my second question is, how is the attack and assault on abortion rights and women's rights a part of like the cog of capitalism?
So this is actually a very big question and a very important question. And the full answer is quite complicated, but it's also very knowable. So what I want to do here is give a simple beginning answer. And more than that, I want to point you to some things and some places where you can dig deeper and really encourage you to do so, because it's very important to get as scientific an understanding of this question as possible. Now, the most essential answer to your question is something that the Christian fascist theocrats, the ones who are waging this assault on abortion rights, bring up all the time. And they say it constantly. The family, the traditional family, they say, by which they mean the patriarchal family, where the male has authority over the woman and the children, is the basic unit of society. They say this all the time. And under capitalism, imperialism, they're right. Think about it. We don't live in a society where people get their basic needs of survival met by the commonwealth of society. No, this gets done through the family. That's how people get the food to eat, the shelter to live in. It's how children are raised. This is done through the family. Whether a child lives on the street, works in a mine somewhere, or lives pampered with the greatest luxury and privilege depends on their family. And capitalism needs this family, this patriarchal family, to keep functioning. And a big part of what's motivating these Christian fascists to assault abortion rights right now is that this patriarchal family, this traditional family, has gone through major changes in recent generations. It's been stretched and strained. And you see women getting, in their view, out of place. You have women in the workforce. You have women in the higher education. You have women in sports. You have women challenging rape culture. You have women saying we shouldn't be in our place. And this drives them crazy. And there is a very, very vitriolic woman-hating movement that is out to exact revenge on women for ever having gotten out of their place. That's why they're going after abortion and, yes, birth control. It's never had anything to do with babies or so-called life. They want to slam women back into their place, and by forcing them to have children against their will, child after child, that drags women out of public life and puts them even more sharply into a subordinate and enslaved position to men and to patriarchal authority. And this system, because it needs this patriarchal family, this system of capitalism, imperialism, especially in a time when it's facing many multiple converging crises. It needs this family reasserted, and this is what's enabled these Christian fascist lunatics, certifiable Dark Ages lunatics, to climb and claw their way into a central position, into what is now a fully fascist Republican Party, and into dominant institutions in society, ruling institutions, like the Supreme Court. And they've been working at this for decades, and now they are in position to seal the deal, to deliver what they've been after, to actually criminalize abortion across this country. They're about on the verge of overturning Roe v. Wade. This is an emergency that people have to stand up against, and it is absolutely rooted in the system of capitalism, imperialism, and its dynamics and crisis it's currently in. So that's a very simple beginning answer, but there's much more to dig into, including how and why this can give rise to its opposite. Massive upheaval, massive outpourings of fury of women that can beat this assault back and be a driving force in bringing this system down, a driving force in real revolution. And there's two places I want to point you to go deeper. One is a statement that Bob Avakian issued last January, his New Year's statement in 2021, where he talks about some of the dynamics of capitalism, imperialism, and how this has interpenetrated and with and driven these changes in the family and this explosive moment we're in where women are on the verge of being enslaved by the state or could rise up and be a dynamic force in bringing this whole state and system down. And the other is the compendium from Bob Avakian, Break the Chains, Bob Avakian on the Emancipation of Women and the Communist Revolution. And this brings together work that Bob Avakian has done on these questions over decades. In one place, it's at revcom.us. It's a profoundly deep scientific work. It merits deep study, wrangling, and discussion with others. Read it, spread it, write into me about what you're thinking about it, what you're encountering. And we're going to be digging into this more as we go forward. So with that, I want to move to the second portion of this segment, which is the excerpts of the interview I did with Sikivu Hutchinson. Here on the RNL, the Revolution Nothing Less show, we have been bringing you the voices of different people involved in the Rise Up for AbortionRights.org movement, people sounding the alarm from different political perspectives with different areas of expertise, different particular strengths and passions they bring to this. And so I'm very happy to share with you right now excerpts of my interview with Sikivu Hutchinson. Sikivu Hutchinson is an author, a novelist, a playwright, and among other things, this is one of her books, Moral Combat, Black Atheists, Gender Politics, and the Values Wars. I'm very happy to welcome her onto the RNL, the Revolution Nothing Less show. She was, among other things, recently participated in the mass protests on International Women's Day around sounding the alarm and standing up against the abortion rights emergency. So Sikivu, welcome.
Good to be here.
Listen, I wanted to start by just giving you the chance to talk about why you participated in the protests on International Women's Day with Rise Up for Abortion Rights, how you see the abortion rights emergency, and why it's so important that people are in the streets standing up against this.
I participated because I have long been committed to pushing the envelope and speaking out and resisting the incredibly Christian, fascistic, authoritarian, stentorian state violence that's being imposed upon the bodies of women and the bodies of people who are attempting to exercise basic human rights and bodily autonomy, as well as economic and reproductive justice. So I felt that it was really critical to come out in this moment where we see an almost cataclysmic convergence of this crackdown on abortion rights, on reproductive justice, on voting rights, on LGBTQ plus and queer human rights, on anti-racist education. All of these convergences are deeply not just discriminatory, but they're almost apocalyptic for communities of color, particularly working class communities of color. And it's important to lift our voices, given the fact that there are so many young people, Gen Z and millennial youth, that are unaware of this legacy of mass resistance to these forces of Christian fascist, basically apartheid.
Mm-hmm. The very final words in the speech that you gave at International Women's Day in Los Angeles on I'm not going to quote it directly, but you said something about how we have to shut down, we have to defeat this terrorist assault, this fascist assault, and this lie. This is what I want to ask you about, this lie of American exceptionalism.
Against the fascists, against the theocrats, and against this lie of American exceptionalism.
Which I think is a particularly important insight that you brought to the stage of so much of what we're up against is the notion that's popular in this country that, oh, fascism can't happen here. The enslavement of women, of forced motherhood, that can't happen here. And it is American exceptionalism, that there's something special about this country that's so democratic and so free that could never happen here. And you call that a lie, and I think that's important. I'd just like you to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I was thinking about that in terms of what's happening in Colombia, what has happened in Mexico, what has happened in Argentina, and scores of other quote unquote third world countries that are decriminalizing abortion. And yet here we are, supposedly, and I hate to use that pronoun we, it's just shorthand. Here the US is, this font of supposedly democracy and egalitarianism and individual liberty and rights. And we're at the precipice of apocalypse when it comes to unrestricted, on demand and without apology abortion for women and people with uteruses. So I just wanted to underscore that irony. And another thing that I cited in the speech was what Alice Walker said in her landmark anthology, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, where she talked about the fact that our great-grandmothers did not have this right as enslaved women, that there were so many other things that our great-great-great-grandmothers could have been doing with their agency, other than being forced to be incubators, to pop out baby after baby in service of the slave regime, in service of plantocracy, in service of racial capitalism, and building brick by brick, body by body, white wealth, white supremacist wealth. So again, important to connect all of these dots when it comes to these gross and violent and terroristic paradoxes of the way in which the US is perceived globally.
My final question is if you have any words that you want to share to people who are watching who maybe didn't know about this emergency, of what they need to be doing. And also for those who say, well, the best we can do is prepare for a post-Roe America and help as many women as we can. If you have any parting words that you want to add?
I say get the fuck out into the streets. Get out into the streets. Talk to other folks of color, particularly young women of color across sexuality. Agitate, resist, disrupt. Write editorials. Give talks, again, in public venues, and try and vote out these fascists. In addition to supporting abortion funds, there are a number of really important abortion funds that specifically help Black, Latinx, and Indigenous working class and Asian working class and low-income women.
All right, Sikivu Hutchinson, I want to thank you so much for making the time and talking with us today here on the Revolution Nothing Less show.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yes, get the fuck out into the streets. Stand up now. April 8th, wear the green everywhere. Spread the green, chalk the green. Get everybody you know to take a stand and show where they stand. And then April 9th, come into the streets and protests being planned across this country. And from there, let's continue to spread this and gather even more people. Send in your ideas. Be talking together with others. We need to get serious about this. We need to take this to a whole other level. Your participation, consciously and actively, is essential in this.
Now we want to turn to the Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and the tremendous stakes that are involved in this struggle. This is a major event. It's one that people must pay attention to and understand what our interests are and what they are not in this war. And to understand the actual terms of this, we're going to turn in a moment to a short film clip from a program I did with my colleague Raymond Latta at Revolution Books in New York City a few weeks ago, where he lays out the basic terms of this. But we have to say this here, that the situation is extremely dangerous for humanity. In our last show, the RNL show number 94 last week, I went into the danger that has been increased of a nuclear war. And Biden was just in Warsaw, Poland, and he said we must commit now to be in this fight for the long haul. And he gave a speech, and off of this speech, there were more threatening moves from the United States and NATO that could protract this war. And every day this war is protracted, it means not only horror for the people of Ukraine, but actually a greater danger for all of humanity. And so we'll be talking about this as the segment goes on. I'm going to be speaking after we showed this film clip from Raymond with Noche Diaz, who's the national spokesperson of the Revolution Clubs. And he's going to talk about some of the questions that have come up from you, the people who are watching this show, and from masses of people that we've encountered in going out with the stand of that we need to be taking of opposing the actions of our own ruling class in relation to the war in Ukraine, as well as opposing both imperialist powers, Russia and the U.S. in this struggle. So let's go to Raymond Latta, and then we'll get right into it with Noche Diaz.
The Russian invasion is not about denazifying Ukraine, as Vladimir Putin proclaims. This invasion is designed to bolster Russia's rivalry with the U.S., to command more influence and create a rival pole of power focused in Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East. For its part, the U.S. is arming Ukraine in order to weaken Russia and prevent Russia from consolidating further imperialist strength and posing greater imperialist challenges to the current world order that the U.S. dominates and of which the U.S. imperialism is the main beneficiary. This conflict in Ukraine is not about Russian autocracy versus American democracy. It is about rivalry between imperial powers.
All right, Noche, welcome back to the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show.
Good to be back.
All right, so we wanted to talk today about some of what the RevComs have been running into, people in the Revolution Club, going out among the people around the war in Ukraine that's been saturating the headlines, telling people how to think about it. And we've gone out to the campuses, as I understand, and have heard about it. We went out in a recent weekend to the Arts District in Los Angeles. It's a very nice area downtown, and people on a weekend, and people were having brunch, and people went out and they challenged people in the midst of their brunch about what's happening in Ukraine and the ways that they're being whipped up to support the U.S., which is one of the two parties who are actually contending with each other that we have no interest in. So I thought it'd be important for us to, for our audience to get into some of the kinds of things that people said back to us, that the pushback a little bit, and then how should they speak to them? And one of the questions that came up, which is not dissimilar to even other kinds of issues that we go out around, was this: what's the point in paying attention to what's happening, or even talking about it, when there's nothing we can do about it? What do we say to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing you got to say is you don't know what can't be done if you're not paying attention. So there's plenty of examples throughout the history of this country of even people who don't know what can be done to put an end to all injustice, confronting what this country is doing and acting against it. People, were part of fighting to end the U.S. involvement and invasion of in Vietnam, that together with the struggle of the Vietnamese people was able to deliver a defeat to an imperialist war that the U.S. was waging there. So you don't even know what's possible if you're not paying attention to what's going on. Okay, so that's one thing that we have to tell people, and we can't let this system get away with numbing and dumbing people down so much that people just, lose all hope or, and don't even know about basic things about what the country they're living in is doing all around the world. And then the U.S. is able to get away with telling everybody that they're the good guys going out to stop the bad guys. And then everybody knows nothing about anything that it is actually doing. And this is how they get people to either support their crimes against humanity or passively accept and go on with their own lives, which, is based on what crimes this country is committing all around the world. So that's the basic thing people get. There's a bigger answer to what needs to be done and to put an end to, this system and this country and what it's carrying out throughout the world. But that's a basic thing people have to confront.
Yeah. And then, some people, look, what we've seen on TV, and there's a reason you're seeing unending coverage of the horrific carnage and price that's being paid by the people of Ukraine. You're not seeing the same thing about what's happening to the people in Yemen, where the U.S. is supporting a war and arming Saudi Arabia in just an absolute genocide in Ukraine. But people say, because they've been inundated that we got to do something for the people in Ukraine. And so what I'm doing is donating to help over there. And what's important now is supporting the Ukrainian people. And so how do we deal with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things we have to really have people confront is that all of this coverage that you're talking about, that is, really showing things that should tug at people's hearts and conscience, but it's being done in a way not to promote the idea that we need to get peace and respect for, sovereign nations and all this stuff. It is to justify and to whip up support for the U.S.'s military, involvement in Eastern Europe and its supplying of weapons to Ukraine. Okay, and it's to get people to rally behind the U.S. in its confrontation with Russia. And it will do no good for the people in Ukraine or anywhere on this planet to escalate this conflict that could bring the whole planet into a global war and even a nuclear confrontation that could spell Armageddon for everybody. Don't tell me that you're doing something good for the people of Ukraine while this is what people are being rallied up behind. But this is what this country is not just fanning right now, but has been pushing towards for decades, okay? That is what we have to confront and oppose and stop right here. Those of us who are, living in this country, demanding no U.S. NATO war with Russia.
Right. When people get into, I want to recommend people watch the previous shows we've had on Ukraine on the RNL Revolution Nothing Less. And go to revcom.us. There's a number of articles there by Bob Avakian and find out about how what's the essence of the struggle there is a contention between two imperialist countries and blocs over who is going to actually dominate that part of the world and in a certain sense dominate the whole world. And so there's an actual struggle there in which the people have no interest, actually, because either one of both are and each are oppressive. And there's more to understand about that, as you said. I want to get to the last question that has come up a bit, which is related to this. People have said to us, yes, look, I get it. The U.S. has done some bad things in the past, but shouldn't we support our government when it's doing something good?
When you get this question, what you need to tell people is stop getting played. What the U.S. government is doing is not good. It is very bad. It is using your outrage at the Russian invasion of Ukraine to cover and to rally behind the United States' attempt to expand its military, political, and economic domination of the world and to rally more support and alliances to its side when competing and in conflict with other imperialists. This is no good, and no decent person should be played into this. We have to oppose this, and those of us working for a revolution in this country have to struggle with everybody who still has, any decency in them to not get played like this and to oppose this country and what it is doing in this part of the world and throughout the world.
Okay. Well, look, before we wrap this up, I think this stand of opposing the American chauvinism, opposing what our own ruling class is doing as the principal aspect of opposing both imperialist countries is very important. And for that reason, the RevComs are raising a slogan that we hope is taken up not only in this country, but around the world. It is this: no U.S.-NATO war with Russia, no World War III. It is this system, not humanity, that needs to become extinct. So with that, Noche, thanks for being on the show this week, and we're going to have you on again soon.
Look forward to it.
All right.
All right.
Next up, we have an illustrated version of the article by Bob Avakian titled "Bob Avakian Calls Out Fronting for This System of Oppression." This illustrated segment is not the full article, but it's the beginning of it, and it's very consistent with what the thematic of our show today is about. It gives you an illustration of how the major media in this country are actually fronting for this system and teach people how to think, as we've been working on this show to teach you what is the actual reality and what are the interests of the people. And this speaks to some of what we spoke about in the previous conversation with Noche Diaz, as the particular segment we developed today goes into the role of the Democrats, and it then feeds into the next segment on the confirmation hearings of Ketanji Brown Jackson, who has been nominated by President Biden to be on the U.S. Supreme Court, and the absolute fascist shit show that went on from the Republicans on this, and the Democrats never taking the fascists on the terms of the fascism that they were arguing. It's really was quite a horror show, but it also relates to some of the points that are in this exposure in Bob Avakian's article of the Democratic Party. Last, I just want to say we're going to, at some point soon in the future, illustrate the entire article, because after what you're going to see next, then Bob Avakian really goes into the way that there was a revolutionary movement among black people in the 1960s and the kind of stand that they took, and contrasts that with what these media mouthpieces who are front for this system today. So that's something to look forward to, and it'll be an important conclusion to this article.
Bob Avakian calls out fronting for this system of oppression. Malcolm X frequently spoke with disdainful anger about the Uncle Tom Negroes of his time, whom he compared to the house slaves on the plantations, who lived in the master's house and identified with the master more than with the field slaves. When the master's house caught on fire, Malcolm pointed out, the house slaves would exclaim, "Master, our house is on fire."
There was two kinds of slaves. There was the house Negro and the field Negro. The house Negro, they lived in the house with master. They lived in the attic or the basement, but still they lived near their master. And they loved their master more than the master loved himself. The house Negro, if the master said, "We got a good house here," the house Negro said, "Yeah, we got a good house here." Whenever the master said "we," he said "we." That's how you can tell a house Negro. If the master's house caught on fire, the house Negro would fight harder to put the blaze out than the master would.
Today, this phenomenon is even more widespread and pronounced, including in the form of bourgeois black media personalities fronting for this system.
We're standing behind NATO. We're standing behind the European Union.
You can see them on MSNBC or CNN as hosts and guest commentators on news shows, pretending to be voices of the people, while they act as cheerleaders for their country's capitalist imperialist system.
The United States, when they decided that Patrice Lumumba wasn't good enough to be the George Washington of the Congo, made sure he was quite gone. You look at Iran, when we decided we didn't like Mossadegh, that was the end of him.
When we decided we didn't like Mossadegh, that was the end of him.
The United States decided we didn't want Saddam Hussein. That was the end of him. Isn't there something we can do? Because when we wanted to do it, and when there were people we thought were not fit to run a country, we did it.
And as mouthpieces for the ruling class, especially the mainstream section of the ruling class, represented by the Democratic Party.
The United States and our allies will defend every inch of territory that is NATO territory with the full force of our collective power. Every single inch.
Uncle Joe is back. Nobody believes in these American ideals more than Joe Biden. It showed tonight.
We should all agree the answer is not to defund the police. It's to fund the police. Fund them. Fund them.
Yeah, I'm proud tonight we have a leader like him. I'm proud tonight.
This is a system which, from the beginning and down to today, has been and remains a monstrous and murderous oppressor of black people, along with millions, indeed billions of others it oppresses, in this country and throughout the world. This is a Democratic Party which, as has been sharply pointed out at revcom.us, is a party of piggery. Its response to the massive outpouring against police brutality and murder is to give full support to carrying out more of this brutality and murder. Why? Because the Democratic Party is a representative and instrument of this system of capitalism imperialism, which requires and cannot do without this brutality and murder by police.
Don't you fucking move, I'm gonna shoot you in your fucking head, you hear me?
This is a reality that was once again made clear by Biden in his State of the Union address, when he declared that the answer is not to defund the police, it's to fund the police, fund the police, fund the police.
Fund the police. Fund them. Fund them.
This is a Democratic Party which treats as heroes the veterans of U.S. wars in places like Iraq, when in reality the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a blatant international war crime, which set in motion events which have cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, created millions of refugees, and unleashed a maelstrom of death and destruction in that part of the world. A blatant international war crime carried out on the basis of flagrant lies about Iraq supposedly possessing weapons of mass destruction.
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 Iraq has weapons of mass destruction.
And being closely linked with Islamic fundamentalist terrorists like Al-Qaeda.
Iraq and Al-Qaeda.
Al-Qaeda, Iraq.
Al-Qaeda, which is now in Iraq.
Al-Qaeda, Iraq.
Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda.
This is a Democratic Party which has consistently been an aggressive advocate for and instrument of U.S. imperialist plunder of people throughout the world, and in particular, the poorer countries of the world.
I have two words for you: predator drones. You will never see it coming. You think I'm joking?
And which has now taken the lead in cynically using Russia's aggression against Ukraine as a means for aggressively pursuing the interest of U.S. imperialism in its rivalry with Russian imperialism. As I have said before, of course, this act of imperialist aggression by Russia deserves to be condemned. But especially for people residing in this country, which again by far holds the record for such acts of aggression, it is a matter of basic principle and profound importance not to be echoing the positions and serving the aims of our imperialists, and instead to be making very clear our opposition to the aims and actions of these U.S. imperialists, who are using opposition to the Russian invasion of Ukraine not as a way of promoting peace or the rights of nations to self-determination, but as a means of furthering U.S. imperialist interests, in opposition to the rival Russian imperialists.
Our final segment today is on the hearings that were held on the nomination of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to the U.S. Supreme Court by President Biden. This is a segment that was produced by Rafael Kadaris, who's a member of the Revolution Tour here in Los Angeles, based on an article that appeared in revcom.us. It's online right now, titled "Rampaging Republic Fascists Set Terms While the Democrats Barely Answer." And this piece draws out the sharp two sides of the capitalist imperialist ruling class in this country at this time, with the fangs out racist repressive fascists that are concentrated in the Republican Party and the establishment Democrats, and how they went at it in different ways, and how the Democrats conciliated with the fascists, and how all of this sharp contention, two different worldviews, two different, completely different programs at the top of society, potentially gives the opening to an actual revolution. So let's watch this now.
Joe Biden's nomination of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court was supposed to be a win for the Democrats, getting a younger appointee on the court and making the court and the whole system seem more legitimate by appointing the first black woman Supreme Court justice. But what has already happened with this appointment is that the forces of white supremacy and fascism have been strengthened. For 3 days of Senate confirmation hearings this past week, snarling Republicans attacked Jackson with venom and lies, forcing her to dance to the tune of a bunch of racist white senators, while Democrats mostly sat back and applauded her professionalism, composure, and perseverance. In other words, her ability to endure and accommodate to oppressors and an oppressive system.
They recommend to babies confess when being racist.
So many of these left-wing radical groups that would destroy the law as we know it declared war on Michelle Childs and supported you.
How do you justify that incendiary rhetoric against pro-life women?
Why in the world would you call Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld and George W. Bush war criminals?
These hearings were not just a circus, as some liberals said, but an assault and a major move by fascist Republicans to set the terms, further normalizing and promoting their horrific agenda. Republicans repeatedly hammered her with the accusation of being soft on child sex offenders.
Judge Jackson handed down a lenient sentence that was below what the federal guidelines recommended.
The way that the law is written, the way that Congress has directed the Sentencing Commission appears to be not consistent with how these crimes are committed. And therefore, there's extreme disparity, as you pointed out. There are judges who are varying because our ultimate charge from this body is to sentence in a way that is sufficient but not greater than necessary to promote the purposes of punishment.
Do you believe child predators are misunderstood?
If you're on the internet trolling for images of children in sexual exploitation, so you don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a horrible thing.
An 18-year-old who possessed and distributed hundreds of images of 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds, and you gave him, frankly, a slap on the wrist.
When prosecutors came before you with child pornography cases, you sentenced the defenders to substantially below.
This is a complete lie. In fact, as a judge, Jackson handed out sentences to convicted child pornography offenders that were in line with most other judges. But this lie does serve two big fascist objectives. First, it appeals to, normalizes, and incites the QAnon section of their base. About 25% of Republicans who believe the literally insane conspiracy theory that the government is run by liberal pedophiles and that a holy war must be waged to exact vengeance and save the children. Second, it is a major attack on the rule of law and the idea that criminal punishments should be based on what's good for society and not based on revenge and bloodlust.
Do you agree with this book that is being taught with kids that babies are racist?
As part of their vicious nationwide white supremacist campaign against critical race theory, banning books, taking over school boards, and passing laws to prevent any teaching of the true history and reality of racial oppression, the Republican fascists baselessly attacked Jackson at the hearing for having a hidden critical race theory agenda.
Is it your personal hidden agenda to incorporate critical race theory into our legal system? You have praised the 1619 Project, which argues the U.S. is a fundamentally racist country.
In fact, Jackson had merely said that the 1619 Project, which sheds some important light on slavery and its legacy, was provocative. And in fact, the U.S. is a fundamentally racist country, founded on slavery, genocide of native people, and theft of land from Mexico, a country whose armed enforcers routinely gun down unarmed black and other oppressed people, and which now leads the world in mass incarcerating its minority population. While this whole fascist assault was going on and these modern-day Nazi book burners were attacking her, what did the Democrat senators do?
I think it's also appropriate that the American public hear a bit more about your brother's story. As I understand it, served the Baltimore Police Department, served in the U.S. Army.
How could this woman possibly have the endorsement of the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the Fraternal Order of Police and be soft on crime?
This was their idea of establishing Ketanji Brown Jackson's qualifications. One of the only Democrat senators who came to Jackson's defense was Cory Booker.
So you faced insults here that were shocking to me.
He ended his speech day 3 of the hearings with these remarks.
This country is getting better and better and better. And when that final vote happens and you ascend onto the highest court in the land, I'm going to rejoice. And I'm going to tell you right now, the greatest country in the world, the United States of America, will be better because of you.
Really, Cory? The greatest country in the world? Getting better and better and better? What the fuck are you talking about? This whole hearing demonstrated 3 basic points. 1, as Bob Avakian wrote, the Republicans have become a fascist party. A party based on open and aggressive white supremacy, male supremacy, and other oppressive relations. A party convinced that only it deserves to rule, moving to manipulate elections and suppress votes in order to gain and hold on to power, refusing to accept the outcome of elections it does not win, determined to gut and pervert the rule of law, trample on people's rights, and adopt what amounts to an undisguised capitalist dictatorship, ready to use violence not only against masses of people, but also against its rivals in the ruling class. 2, the Democrats cannot and will not fight fascism the way it needs to be fought. They can't call out these fascists for what they are because they represent the same capitalist imperialist system and have no answers to the white supremacy, male supremacy, and brutal wars that are built into it. 3, this hearing tore off the facade of unity around Ukraine or any kind of normalcy, revealing the profound crisis and deepening divisions in this country. Ask yourself, what kind of country, what kind of system allows for such an ugly, racist, misogynist inquisition as part of its political process? This is a system that needs to be overthrown. Instead of getting behind the Democrats and their efforts to disguise this barbaric, racist country with diversity and inclusion and lies about democracy for all, or the Republicans who just want to make all this oppression even worse, we need to take advantage of these divisions to build up the forces for revolution.
So that brings us to the end of the 95th episode of the RNL Revolution Nothing Less show. I want to thank you for watching, and I want to encourage you to get together with friends and watch this show. Even if you've watched it alone now, get some people together and talk about the show and then spread it to others. There's nothing else like this on the internet. I went into some of this at the beginning of the show, why this show matters to understand the world as it actually is and how it could be radically transformed through a real revolution to bring about a world where all of humanity would be emancipated from the enslavement to this capitalist imperialist system. We urge you to write us at revcom at the revcoms@gmail.com and to become a Patreon, a supporter of this show. And with that, I'm going to say goodnight, and we'll see you next week on Thursday night, 5 p.m. Pacific time and 8 p.m. New York time. Till then, be well and get out in the streets next Friday and Saturday for Rise Up for Abortion Rights.